In Conversation with Terry Shepard, award-winning broadcaster, narrator, and author. A deep dive into the writer's craft with the artists and support systems who create the stories we love.
Thanks, Lisa. Left Coast Crime Week continues on the program as we visit with first-time attendee McCracken Poston. He has been a criminal defense attorney, a politician, and part-time juvenile court judge. He gained national attention for several notable cases, which found their way to CNN, Dateline, NBC, A&E's American Justice Series, and the Forensic Files. His book, Zenith Man, Death, Love, and Redemption in a Georgia Courtroom, is the fascinating story of his representation of Alvin Ridley in the 1999 murder trial where Ridley was accused of imprisoning his wife for decades before killing her. Our conversation took place in the lobby of the Hyatt Regency in Bellevue, Washington. Welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Terry. It's so nice to see you and meet you and have dinner with you a couple of times. It's been great.
I love conferences like Left Coast Crime because I always come home with new friends.
Yeah, I feel a little bit like the oddball here. I'm not from the Northwest. I'm from Northwest Georgia, if you count that. And then I've got a true crime book here. And I've really enjoyed getting to know people who actually use their imaginations for their story. I feel an admiration for them because I think they have a tougher road. I had a real case. I actually used a trial transcript for everything anybody says on the stand in my book actually came from a transcript. And also kind of pivoted from the newspaper articles that were going on through the trial because my client was reacting to them in real time. He would be very upset about newspaper articles. So I wrote them, but also as touchstones for the reader to know this is a true story.
How did you come to represent Alvin Ridley?
Well, he went to high school with my oldest sister. He was unusual, bullied a lot in school. Ringgold was a very small town where everybody was in everybody's business, and we had the fortune of living in Graysville, a smaller town just near the Tennessee state line. And my father really liked Alvin, did business with him. Alvin was a Zenith TV salesman and repairman, and he was an ace at TV repair. I never found anybody that had a bad experience with him when he was in the TV business. Unfortunately, the technology changed. In the 80s, central solid state circuitry started happening. And as Alvin laments, people just throw their TVs away now. And that's true. But TVs at the time were like giant pieces of furniture. They were in, especially a console set, it was literally in furniture. And so it was very inconvenient to pick it up and take it in for repair. So Alvin came with a bag that looked a lot like a doctor's bag, a big square bag full of different picture tubes and tools. And but over the years, you know, things started to get harder for him. But what Ringgold is known for is it's where Dolly Parton and Carl Dean slipped away and got married in 1966, in May of 1966. Well, 3 weeks later, Alvin and Virginia Hickey from the next county over got their marriage license in 1966 and got married. Well, by the time George Jones and Tammy Wynette slipped down to Ringgold, because by the time you know now we are a quickie marriage capital of the South, by the time George Jones and Tammy Wynette came to Ringgold to kind of domesticate their foreign marriage, Virginia Ridley was already missing. And her parents were putting articles in the paper like, "Parents seek married daughter." And they would say, "Last seen with her husband, Alvin Ridley." So they were pretty much pointing the finger of blame at Alvin Ridley.
Yes.
They were saying he is, he's the last person seen with her. Well, Alvin was wanting me to examine this basic ancient litigation that he was involved in. And I was saying, no, this is a murder case. We have to examine your wife. We have to explain what happened to your wife. He goes, no, we don't, because I didn't do it. But the county did take my van in that case. He was obsessed with the fact that a counterclaimant temporarily took his van. He got it back in 3 weeks, but he refuses to touch it to this day, now 40 years, and there's trees growing all around it. In his mind, there is a statute of limitations that triggers if he touches it. So I had to go into this world of Alvin's way of thinking. And in order to keep his trust, I had to follow him into that world and kind of acknowledge it and even spend some time in it, in investigating all this old civil litigation. It helped me learn a lot about him. It also helped me learn that her parents, Virginia's parents' effort to flush her out resulted in an eviction from public housing. This young couple had gotten into our brand new public housing. They got a 2-bedroom apartment. What I learned was the housing manager allowed the exterminator to come in while she was in the house taking a bath. She was already very homebound in terms of she did not like to get out. She had epilepsy. She was medicating for it, but she often had reactions to the medication. But suddenly, she's a young, pretty girl, and she's in the bath, and the exterminator comes in. And instead of saying, whoops, excuse me, he asks her out on a date. So the way Alvin reacted was, not in a fight or a confrontation, the way the Alvin reacted was, well, let's get you out of here on the days we think he's going to run. And eventually, just about every day, Alvin would take her and let her stay with someone while he did or stay at the TV shop. Well, ultimately, her parents got the housing authority to evict them. So September 15, 1970, and of course, Alvin is very litigious. He's fighting the eviction and demands a jury trial. So they're having a jury trial on an eviction. And September 15, 1970, the judge stopped this trial and said, Mr. Ridley, send someone for your wife, but you stay right here. So Alvin's father went and got Virginia. She shows up to an eviction trial where her parents are attending. And her parents and Virginia and Alvin's father go back into chambers. And Virginia basically says, look, I'm with my husband. I'm a Christian. I feel like once I'm married, I'm part of him. And her parents never tried to flush her out after that date. 27 years later, she dies after nobody seeing her for 27 years. What the community reacted to, nobody knew about that eviction case. And so they just took the old family line that this man is imprisoning her. And her siblings who were surviving their father, their mother was in a nursing home, her siblings kept the story going, that she's been locked up. Unfortunately, some of our public officials picked up on that line and delivered it with the body to the state crime lab in Atlanta.
McCracken Poston is our guest. We're talking about his fascinating book, Zenith Man, Death, Love, and Redemption in the Georgia Courtroom. How did you get tapped for this trial?
Well, when suddenly everybody's talking about this dead woman at Alvin Ridley's house, the first reaction is, who's missing? And nobody's reaction was, he wouldn't do that. Everybody's reaction was, who did he get? Who did he get? And then when we learned that he says it's his wife and nobody's seen her in 27 years, then it became even weirder. But the very next Monday after she died on a Saturday, he is stalking me. He's seeing me on the street. He won't speak to me. But then the next day, he meets me at the same corner. Now, this is a guy that I could go years without seeing, and suddenly I'm seeing him 2 days in a row. The third day, I'm realizing this is by design. And so I spoke first, and he just opened up and poured out his heart but it was kind of a nonsensical. The county worried her to death, and now they're talking to me about her. And my lawyer instincts just said, well, don't talk. Yeah. And of course, I later learned that he met with them again that afternoon and that he buried his wife that afternoon. And so I think very late in the case did I realize that Virginia liked me. And I asked him very often, why did you pick me? Because he didn't trust anybody, and he didn't trust me. And he said, I'll tell you one day. Well, he brings by the office an old VHS cassette. And on it, on this re-recorded and taped over blank cassette, here's my name in now what I've recognized as her very familiar handwriting. And I said, thank you. What is this? He says, you can't have it, but you can look at it. So we were at my office, and this was 1999, so I had a VHS player in the office for evidence and stuff. Popped it in. It was the one congressional race that was televised in my last political race that I was destroyed in. But he said, she always liked you. And my first thought was not enough to register and go vote, but, I'll take it because Alvin gave me a second act and maybe now a third with this book. The story is about the ordeal of representing Alvin Ridley, the trauma even of representing Alvin Ridley. He was such a difficult client. Terry, only 3 years ago, did a juror from the case reach out to me and say, I think he may be autistic. Only 3 years ago. I took Alvin, with his permission, of course, to Atlanta, and a specialist for adults on the autism spectrum diagnosed him as very much on the autistic spectrum. And so this finally formed the book in my head, the book that I've been wanting to write for years and years. But I never could explain Alvin. It just wasn't satisfactory to me to say, oh, yeah, he's eccentric, by the way. It almost sounded flippant, just to say, he's just an oddball, he's just eccentric. Now I had an explanation for Alvin, and there are 5.5 million adults that have not been diagnosed to be on the spectrum. They are every day having encounters in life, encounters with law enforcement, lawyers, and judges. Those are 3 areas that could use some extra training on neurodivergent people. And so I'm hoping if there is a call to action found in my book, that's it. What I've been touched by is how the reaction of people with an autistic or neurodivergent loved one in their family, how they've accepted the book. Because I didn't know how it would be received. The autism community, the neurodivergent community, sometimes fights among itself of how it's portrayed and how it's represented. So I decided to just write it honestly because I was ignorant. And so I exposed my own ignorance. Not only that, I started diving into deeply what probably made me the worst lawyer for Alvin. And that was my neurotic micromanaging. And I explored where that was coming from. And right in this period of time, I was with my sisters. We were intervening with our loving but pitifully alcoholic father. That all of our lives, he had been alcoholic. Wonderful guy, never abusive, but in a way that's maybe worse because you can never find the ability to hate. You always turn inward and say, why is he like this? What can I do to keep him from drinking? What can I do to keep things on an even keel? And I carried that into adulthood. It's cost me 2 marriages probably. just the just neurotic micromanaging. And there I was facing a guy who would not accept it, and I was not interpreting him, and he was not interpreting me. The fact that we got through a trial is amazing. I had lost that congressional race overwhelmingly. I was kind of at the bottom of my life, had gone through a divorce, and that's when Alvin came along. And he gave me a challenge. Yes, I thought about maybe this is too much, maybe I need to back away. I noticed that in all his ancient civil litigation that he started out with a lawyer, and then in it, he'd end up representing himself. And now I understood why. And the moment, Terry, that made me think I'm going to stick with this guy was he was in the office with me when I finally got him to come in. And the secretary, my secretary at the time, came in and said, "Congressman Deal called you." And that was the guy that just completely destroyed me in my race for Congress less than 2 years before. And I thought, what this about? And Alvin started straightening up. He and I later learned his wife, they always felt that federal government was going to be their savior. They did not trust any other levels of government, but federal, they thought they would be their savior, which actually kept recurring throughout this representation. So, I thought, well, I'll take the call. It'll impress Alvin that I know a congressman. So I called, "Hello, Congressman, how are you doing?" He said, he ordered, "Keep Alvin Ridley away from my congressional offices. He's frightening the women." And so gladly it wasn't on speakerphone. I thanked him for his call, told him I'd pass the word along, hung up, and I thought, how am I going to handle this? Because I know enough about him now that if you order him to do something, he's going to resist even more. And he's going to think you're with the enemy. And so I took him outside to his car. And I said, "Alvin, you know that damn Congressman Deal?" And he looked at me kind of surprised and nodded his head. And I said, "He hates me so much that he just told me that if me or you go to his congressional offices, he's going to have us both arrested." I said, "Alvin, I can't afford to be arrested right now. But if you'll just hang with me, if you'll just do as I say to help your case and stay away from his congressional office, when this is over, I'll take you and show you where he lives." That satisfied him enough that I wasn't the enemy and that we were figuring out a way to let him still petition his government as soon as we get this pesky little murder trial out of the way. And so I had to find little creative ways to work around him, even though I didn't know what I was working with. I realized that he was very transactional. And at this time, I've got so much skin in the game, it's a matter of pride. I was feeling like this guy really did love his wife, but he won't let me in his house. And he won't let me photograph that there's not bars on the windows like the people in the paper and the people in the National Examiner tabloid are saying. Why won't he let me in his house? Well, Thanksgiving, a number of things started happening. Tragically, the Olympic track star Florence Griffith Joyner died in September of 1998, giving us the seizure death that I was needing to find to compare to Virginia Ridley's death. Because of HIPAA, it's really hard to find a seizure. Plus, there's good medications now. Fewer people are dying from seizures than ever before. And the state of Georgia was calling these petechial hemorrhages around her eyes and mouth as evidence of that she was physically murdered by her husband. There was no damage to her neck except for what the coroner did, kind of ham-handedly, assistant coroner, with trying to get blood draw. So it was, this was a gift, tragically. And I got that autopsy. I've wanted that autopsy, and I got it. And I shared it with the state. I'm saying, look, here's the most famous woman in the world. And here's her autopsy after a known seizure death. And it looks just like Virginia. In fact, if Virginia Ridley was murdered, then FloJo was brutally murdered because she's got more of it. And that they didn't buy it. So we took it to trial. But the other amazing thing that happened was my parents on Thanksgiving of 1998, as I was leaving, they prepared a turkey plate. And they said, we want you to take this to Alvin Ridley. And that's the last place I wanted to spend my day off, was with this guy that I just fought with every day throughout the week. The trial was 5 weeks away. I drove my new wife home, who was barely understanding my obsession here. I went to Alvin's house. I knew the way around this imposing gate that the newspapers wrote about like it was a fortress. There was an easy way around it. Alvin was all show on the fortress business, and made it up to his door and knocked on the door. He came to it. By the way, I tried to get in his house by paying for the reestablishment of his phone service. And when he realized that I wanted to come with the phone guy to get in his house, he had it installed on the porch. So this time I've given up. I'm just going to give him his turkey and go home. But he sees it. His transactional nature is kicking in. He says, wait a minute. He comes back in the house. I hear him. I feel like I hear him talking to somebody. I hear the TV turn off. He says, come in. And I went into one of the strangest, creepiest houses I've ever been in. But on one wall, he had created a shrine of writings. And these were just mundane things that his wife wrote, but she was prolific in her writing. She wrote constantly. I said, did she write any more? He took me to another room where it was floor to ceiling, stacked in boxes. A lot of it was being degraded by vermin and silverfish and the things that destroy paper. But they were poetry, they were recipes, it was a loose leaf daily journal of decades. And she clearly loved her husband. She clearly studied the Bible intensely. But there were a few items in there that were so critical to his defense that I said, Alvin, I got to have these. I said, why do you think she wrote so much? He said, well, I guess the Lord told her to write. I said, I got to have this. He said, you can't have it. That's all I've got left of her. You can't have it. He was being Alvin, and it was now jeopardizing his defense. So in the book, the reader will read the actual things I went through to try to get him to commit to letting me use these documents. Finally, he came up with a solution. He'll rent them to me for $200. And the renting allowed me to copy as the select ones, because I couldn't copy there. I estimate there were 15 to 20,000 entries. But I spent 4 days in this very unpleasant house with rats and vermin and cockroaches. And I'm identifying and I'm making piles. And I'm having to use an extra light because the lighting was so bad. And I had this system to where I put the key ones in a certain envelope, and I would put the date on it that I put them in. And then that way I would make copies and put the copies in a dated file. I had to make a DA a copy. But then I could go to my file, find out, here's the dated. That all went when Alvin started changing things up. So it was total confusion at trial. But her writings told the jury, they thought they had been fed that line that she'd been locked up for 30 years. She wrote President Richard Nixon complaining about their eviction, got a letter back from a U.S. senator and the Housing and Urban Development agency, referencing the President Nixon wants them to look into this. She wrote 2 other presidents. She wrote congressmen at the federal level. She wrote all these people at the federal level while all the locals were thinking, and Alvin was telling them, she left me years ago. And that was just to throw off her family. So I went through such an ordeal, but little things along the way now I look back at and think, why didn't I know his issues were autism? Because nobody was talking about adult autism in 1997, 98, and 99.
McCracken Poston is our guest. We're talking about his adventures with Alvin Ridley. And the book is Zenith Man, Death, Love, and Redemption in a Georgia Courtroom. How did you turn all of this mundane court stuff into a book?
When I learned of Alvin's autism, I had been trying for years. We gave the story away for years. I had a disastrous witness that we hired only because Alvin, it was the one time Alvin engaged in the trial, was I hired a forensic pathologist. I had to spell it for Alvin every time I mentioned it, forensic pathologist. He would write it down dutifully on this wad of paper he had in his pocket. But he was a disaster. I didn't vet him. He wasn't even licensed to do what I was putting him up to testify about. But Alvin was engaged. And so, I would, that guy who was a disaster pitched the case to Forensic Files. And I told him, I said, do not put this guy on here. He almost lost the case for us. He's a fraud. And they said, oh, he gave us the story. We got to put him in it. And I was furious, but we participated. Now I'm so thankful because they rerun this show every month for 20 years. So people are familiar with the case, but we did not know about Alvin's autism. So I continued to give the story away to anybody who would listen. I was almost inviting people, help me understand this guy. And 3 years ago, a juror in the case reached out to me through a third party. And she was now a nurse in Alaska. And she said, I've been kind of haunted by this because I think Alvin may be autistic. And it was like the scales fell from my eyes. I suddenly realized it makes all the sense in the world because now I know people who are autistic. 25 years ago, I didn't know any adults who were autistic. Back then, it was all about children, and there was a lot of time wasted. Let's find the culprit, what's causing this. We've had people on the spectrum since time began, and many of them have been our greatest contributors to our culture and our science and our arts. And Alvin, it explains why Alvin was such a laser-focused TV repairman. He could fix anything. And so it just was, it all formed as a book in my head 3 years ago. Even though I had written down anecdotal things like the cat story, which I won't go into, but if no cats were harmed in the making of this story, but people do need to read about Kitty and Meowie Ridley. And they showed a side of Alvin that I had not seen. He had a deep love for animals and care for animals that revealed itself all throughout the case. Not enough to take him to the vet, but, he took care of him in his own way. So anyway, it finally formed in my head as a book. And I've been very touched at how the reaction of people with a neurodivergent loved one in their lives, how they've reacted to this book, because they see it from page one. They pick up on the manifestations while the state of Georgia was using those manifestations as evidence of guilt. Listen to his flat vocal effect on the 911 call, they would tell the jury. His emotions don't seem like the ones of a guy who just lost his wife. those were neurodivergent manifestations. Yeah, it's how he's wired. And because of my, adult child of an alcoholic parent, micromanaging and neurotic state, I possibly was the worst lawyer for him. But we kind of figured out a way to work together.
How'd you win the case?
Alvin, well, I will say this. Jesus appeared to Alvin during lunch, during the trial, right after our disastrous forensic pathologist witness who was destroyed by the state. Jesus appeared to Alvin during lunch and told him, in spite of what that lawyer is telling you, you need to take the stand. And Jesus was right. I was so over concerned with how Alvin would be interpreted because all he wanted to talk about was the government taking his van in 1984. That's all he wanted to talk about. He thinks that that's what killed his wife because she worried about it. And interestingly enough, one of Virginia's longest writings was a pitch to the TV show Unsolved Mysteries. It was a draft of the pitch to that show about the taking of Alvin's van. So they belonged together. They were a team. And I really realized, but he testified, and I just decided I'm going to let Alvin be Alvin. I was worried about them thinking that, but let me just let him tell his whole story. And an Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporter put it best. He said, Alvin Ridley finally got on the stand that he had been trying to take for 30 years in all of his litigation. And he didn't even get to take the stand in the eviction trial. And now suddenly he gets to take the stand. So I just let him talk about the eviction. I let him talk about the taking of the van and all the injustices that he had felt over the years. But he had a sincerity to him that I think the jurors realized this guy is for real. He believes these things. And but I would get ahead of myself. I forget how transactional he is. And so I thought, man, he's doing well. I need to finish strong and direct. I said, Alvin, tell the jury what you lost. And I was wanting to say the love of my life, my best friend. He said, oh, I figure the funeral bill. And of course, the DA tore him apart with that. And I just thought, why didn't I think that was on me? Why didn't I realize the guy's so literal? I have to just ask him literal questions.
And I'm still confused as to what it was about his sincerity in that world that convinced those jurors to acquit him.
Virginia wrote what I call the Rosetta Stone of her writings. There was one document that I almost didn't get because Alvin's other legal advisor, a guy named Salesman Sam, who sold pencils from the basket of his bicycle, was his other legal advisor, that he would run through all of my legal advice through Salesman Sam, and Salesman Sam would tell him which parts to take. So Salesman Sam would move some of the documents, and it was driving me crazy. So I had to steal some of the documents from Alvin in order to make sure I had something for him at that trial. But one of Virginia's documents spoke of the fact that they never went out, that she did not like to go out, that she was basically admitting being agoraphobic, that she did not want to see her family, that she didn't go to her dad's funeral because God says that once you marry your husband, you're one with your husband, and she doesn't want to go even if she wasn't married because he helped get them evicted out of that apartment. So she was quirky and eccentric, maybe on the spectrum herself. But she died of a syndrome called sudden death in epilepsy. And we had an expert, Dr. Braxton Bryant Wanamaker from South Carolina.
That sounds like a winner. With a name like that.
The night before I put him on the stand, after a very awkward dinner that, he's very man that just didn't chat a lot. And I felt like a kid. I was just like, and then this, and then this. And at the very end of dinner, he said, was there anything else unusual about this woman? Because he was there to explain the petechial hemorrhages. He said, oh, my clients get them all the time. My living clients walk in and they have them. I go, oh, you had a seizure? Yeah. He said, is there anything else unusual about this woman? I said, yeah, she couldn't think without writing it down. He said, that's hypergraphia. It's often accompanies temporal lobe epilepsy. He said, it doesn't affect what she writes, but it compels her to write it. And there have been known hypergraphics through the years. One was a guy named Inman who was wealthy, and he had his published. They're called the Inman Diaries. There's volumes of his just observations and thoughts. Virginia's was loose leaf on anything that would bear ink or pencil, and it made a sense once we could tell the jury this is what was compelling her to write. And through Dr. Wanamaker, we were able to tell the jury. And then through what she wrote, the jury realized she really loved her husband. And the way she described her husband, he really loves her.
How has this experience affected your life since, professionally and personally?
Well, Alvin gave me a second act because suddenly now I had a win in life, which I was sorely needing, but I also had a win in a high-profile criminal case. The next case that came along, some of your listeners may be familiar with, it was not a win, but it was certainly an experience. I represented Byron Low-Tax Looper in Tennessee, where he murdered his political opponent, a state senator, in a pumpkin field. I had known Byron since he was basically a teenager. He was from North Georgia, but he used to hang around the legislature when I was down there. And he went up to Tennessee, changed parties, changed his middle name from Anthony to Low Tax, and got elected. So I jokingly said, let's change it to not guilty. If the people are so influenced by what your name is up here that they would elect you, maybe we should change it to not guilty. But he was convicted of the murder of Senator Tommy Burke.
So you can lose and win.
Oh, yeah. And then a couple of years later, I had the tri-state crematory debacle in northwest Georgia, closer to home, where there were 334 uncremated bodies just stored. My client, I am convinced, was mercury poisoned by the 2/3 of the bodies that were successfully burned, and a very compromised retort oven that was filling the room with smoke anytime a body was burned, and the dental amalgam from the dead gets vaporized, and it's breathing in vaporized mercury. CDC will tell you, don't do it. Now we used to play with mercury when a thermometer broke, but now when a thermometer breaks in a school, if they run the vacuum cleaner over it, it's going to aerate some of it. You spill mercury in a school now, or if some is found in a building, that building is sealed off and hazmat teams come in to, get rid of it. So that, I just kind of became a criminal defense lawyer, and that's what all I've done for the last 25 years.
Do you have another book in you? Is there something else you'd like to write?
My publisher keeps asking me. My agent, though, says, enjoy this one. So that's why I came out here to Washington to kind of plant the seeds of this book around a bunch of readers that come here. Been very warmly received, even though I'm not a mystery writer. I envy the imaginations of these people. But I'm now realizing that every one of them is putting a lot of their own life and experience into their characters. And I think that's fascinating. And that makes sense. And so maybe they're giving me the key to mystery writing or fiction, which I find in one way freeing because I don't have to get all these permissions that I have to do in a nonfiction. But in another way, I feel that it would be taxing on the imagination to have to come up with all that.
How can people find more about McCracken Poston and this great book?
Zenith Man, Poston will get you to the reviews, and I'm extremely proud of the reviews, especially, again, the ones from people with neurodivergent loved ones. Those are the proudest reviews that I have because I managed to not offend. You know, Alvin had a dignity about him, even though he does not like the way water feels on his skin, so he never bathes. And the only bath I know him to have had was the VA nurses forced him into having one before his cataract surgery. And he probably needed it. And but my secretary and I, we keep him in clothes and we keep him in warm in the winter. And when it got extremely cold 2 years in a row, I've put him up in a local hotel. And he kind of enjoys it because then he's got 200 channels to watch, you know. He's obsessed with this TV show called Cheaters, where they expose extramarital affairs. And he said he'd like to have 2 girlfriends, but he is worried about cheaters rolling up on him and exposing him. So Alvin is having the life that he's always deserved, but he's never had. Because of the book. The community had a birthday party for him, and over 200 people showed up. And of course, they wanted him to sign their book, but they also brought him gifts. And of course, Alvin does not act very, outwardly emotional or even appreciative. He just signs their book, looks up, signs their book. And I keep forgetting that. And, there'll be a juror from the case rounded the corner. I said, Alvin, it's one of our jurors. And he just looks up and goes back to signing books. But then he tells me at the end when we're going to do some more of these book signings. And so I'm thinking he enjoyed it. So, I've kind of set out to take care of Alvin. And between my secretary and I, we're going to try to take care of Alvin. He's 82 now. He and I go to lunch 2 days a week. I imagine as I near retirement, that's probably going to increase. But he's threatening to live to 110, so that'll mean like almost 30 more years of free lunch.
He'll outlive us all.
Well, he told me the other day he does not, and I think inside there is almost a childlike fear of death. But now he comforts himself in saying that the rapture is coming before then, so he doesn't have to go through that process of actual death.
McCracken Poston in Conversation, recorded live at Left Coast Crime Seattle Shakedown 2024.
In Conversation with Terry Shepard is a copyrighted presentation. All rights reserved. I'm Lisa Davis. Join Terry Shepard next time in Conversation.